Hi, welcome to The Weaver Sews. I'm Daryl Lancaster. It's pretty much accepted practice that when you finish weaving something, you cut it off the loom. It really needs to have a lovely visit with some water. The yarns have been stretched under tension for a while. The yarn needs to be able to bloom and fill up all those little spaces and make a cloth that feels good and will be so much easier to work with, especially hand-woven cloth that will become clothing. How you wash your fabric will depend on many factors. In fact, I am never sure of exactly how I want to wash something. I always do a test sample first, even before I finish weaving the final cloth. When I plan my yardage, I always expect that I will waste the first foot or so in sampling. This is a great place to try out different types of weft yarn, whether or not you would actually consider using the yarn for the finished yardage. How warp and weft yarns interact with each other under different conditions becomes a terrific science project. Never turn down an opportunity to see what happens if. Typically, when I warp a loom for yardage, I start weaving by trying different wefts. A couple of inches of any given weft yarn will give enough of a reading to know how it will interact with the warp. I might try half a dozen different options. Always a cellulose option like cotton or rayon, and usually a protein option like some kind of wool. I might try a dark value yarn, and I might try a light value and maybe one in the middle. I might try a thick weft and a thin one. And I usually throw in something completely unexpected, something I wouldn't think would work, because you never know. There is magic when yarns interlace, and you can't always plan the result. Once I've experimented with enough wefts that I think I'll get the information that I need, I cut the sample off the loom. Then I take that sample, which is the width of the actual yardage on the actual loom, and I cut it into 3 sections. The first sample is put aside and kept in a notebook. It's easy to see what wefts were used and what the fabric looked like on the loom. No matter what yarns were used, the fabric is coarse and lacking flexibility. It doesn't feel good. The second sample is finished off around the edges. A simple row of machine stitching will work. And off I go with a small bucket or a sink full of tepid water with a little shampoo or Synthropol textile detergent and swish the sample around for a couple of minutes. I rinse the sample and then roll it in a towel to remove excess moisture and then hang to dry. This sample will have what I call minimum wet finishing. And you can already feel the difference in the hand of the fabric. What happens if you want to maybe see what that fabric is capable of? I stitch around the third sample a couple of times for good measure, and then I go off and I do a load of laundry. Sheets, towels, jeans, whatever I would normally wash. The sample gets thrown in with the load. I'll toss in a color catcher or two if the sample might have yarns that have the potential for bleeding, or if I notice that the second sample produced bleeding when I hand washed it. I add my regular laundry detergent, which is Tide powder, and a half a cup of distilled white vinegar in the rinse dispenser. I'll talk more about that later. I use a regular wash cycle in a top loader, warm wash with a cold water rinse, and then I toss the entire load with the sample in the dryer and dry on a low setting, because that's what I do with the regular laundry. In most cases, there will be a huge difference between the unwashed sample and the maximum wet finished sample. The second sample will fall somewhere in between. I've always considered the washer or the dryer to be a serious part of my design team. Somewhere in between the minimum and the maximum wet finished samples is what I'm most likely to do with the actual fabric once it's off the loom. But it's really important to know what this fabric and these yarns are capable of. So now I'm going to go through a few samples that I have pulled from my archives to just give you a feel for how this works. This is a sample of mixed rayons and cottons, almost all of which I have hand dyed. And you can clearly see every couple of inches I've tried a different kind of weft. There's textured ones, there's light ones, there's dark ones. And in there are definitely some that are a finer wool. So when I hand washed the sample, things started to puff up and I got a little bit meatier of a fabric and a much better hand. When I threw this entire sample into the machine, I really saw the difference. A lot of the rayons and cottons just got puffier and somewhat softer, but this piece right here, this was Jaeger Spun's Zephyr, which is a merino and silk combination. It fulled beautifully. This fabric right here is amazing. And although I still see clarity of design, all the fabric just pulled together and created a beautiful cloth. And as a matter of fact, that's what I ended up using to weave the cloth with. And this is the handling sample from an exhibit where this piece showed. And here's another sample. When I hand paint a warp, a lot of times the beginning of the warp is less than spectacular. So you're not really going to get a terrific reading of light versus dark and how it tonally interacts with the painted warp. But you get a real feel for what the wefts will do in a washing situation. So this was right from the loom. This was hand washed and air dried, and already there's a huge difference in how this fabric feels. And then, because I tried that Zephyr again, I have a lot of it, so it gets tried a lot, but that Zephyr in here ended up fulling beautifully. Although I kind of like the others as well, and I ended up using an actual rayon for the weft. So this is the final handling piece, again for a garment that was exhibited. And I have this garment right here. So this also gives you a good example of the bottom of the warp. When I first started weaving was less than gorgeous, but there were some fabulous color areas that I wanted to make sure that the weft I chose would also read well off of. Here's another sample right from the loom. Again, hand-painted warps, all rayons and cottons and combinations. This one right here, this heavier slub, that has actually a little bit of silk slub in it, which takes a fiber reactive dye slightly different. But that said, this is right from the loom, and this is the hand washed. And you'll see, again, I had some areas that had a wool content in there, which fold up slightly different even in a hand wash situation. What I love about this trio here is the difference in the machine washed sample. So this is machine washed and dried on a regular cycle, just like I've been describing. And you can see the rayons just got beautifully drapey. And there's the wools. I had a couple of them, which you would have never known if you had looked at this original sample. So this, from right off the loom, turned into this and heavily fulled or felt. In this case, it actually felted. The wools that I used here had a merino content, and it's very important to understand that not all wool is the same, and some will full differently. There's different degrees. Merino fulls very easily, actually felts very easy, which is why it is the wool of choice amongst felters. This particular yarn, Zephyr, has a wool and silk combination, but the wool is merino. Webb's also carries a version of this, which is merino and tencel. It's their Coleraine lace. And the link for that will appear in the show notes. Just as a FYI, in case you're curious as to how this turned out, the fabric I ended up using had a rayon weft. And I had some leftover of that fabric, and it is making the top that I have on. I'm a big fan of having some kind of protein weft that will actually full up slightly, that I can control in the wash. And I'd wanted to experiment with a number of the offerings that Silk City Fibers provides. So I did this test. The warp is a cotton tape and rayon novelty, alternating. And I wanted to try different wefts to see what would happen. So the top one here is their wool crepe, which is a wool and rayon mixed yarn, and it still has some spring to it. The second one is their baby alpaca. It's also, when you look at the dark warp versus the light warp, you really see a much tweedier interaction. A mid-value warp, this is their Supra Merino. And I did want to try it because, as I suspected, this is a superwash yarn. And I'm not really a fan of superwash wools because their scales are stripped out and they don't come together. They don't have the ability to full. And I want that control in my cloth. This here is their Eco Casual, which is 50% cashmere and a 50% virgin wool. I don't know the breed of sheep. And the last one here is their merino, called Nature's Way Merino. Now, all of these yarns, other than their value, light, dark, mid-value, they all look as though they are completely interchangeable. And one might judge, based on value, what to use for the weft. But I did cut this sample off. And the second sample, I did my basic in a basin with some cool water and tepid water, and I just swished it around for a bit and then rolled it in a towel and hung it to dry. You can already see a slightly different hand. The wool crepe is very springy now. It's a kind of springy yarn, which might be really fun in what I have in mind for this fabric. The baby alpaca got fuzzier, but it didn't shrink at all. The Super Merino, as I suspected, didn't shrink at all either. The Eco Casual feels wonderful. It's starting to get a hazy fuzz, and it did full up a little bit. And the merino, of course, there's nothing like merino. This just feels fantastic. So then I took the entire sample and into the washer it went. I love the wool crepe. This is actually what I'm weaving the cloth with now. So this one I will be using. The alpaca, although it didn't shrink at all, just bloomed and got incredibly fuzzy. The Supra Merino, which is their superwash yarn, nothing happened. It looks basically the same as it did when I wove it. The Eco Casual is really beautiful, and I would use that in a heartbeat in future projects. And of course, the merino actually felted. So this is good to know. It's also good to know how far I can push a yarn. If I were to weave this cloth with the merino, I would probably not throw it in the dryer. I would probably stick to just hand wash with maybe a little bit warmer water. This is one of my favorite samples to talk about when I talk about washing your cloth. I experimented with a number of different wefts, and one of the wefts that I tried I really, really loved, and that was this Harrisville yarn from the 70s. It was a singles, and I I tried it along with a bunch of other things, a lot of rayons. What I loved about this Harrisville singles was it was the perfect size, and I figured it would be able to full up a little bit. I also tried a dark black yarn. You can see that right below here. When I hand washed the sample, I noticed a little bit of fulling in the wool, which is what I was looking for. And I began to really love what the black in the adjacent area was doing. When I machine washed and dried the fabric, I absolutely loved this area. This is exactly what I was going for. This was the Harrisville singles. Well, guess what? Harrisville singles is, although the yarn is available, it's available as applied yarn, not as a singles anymore. Although I found out later I could have ordered it. The problem when you have a huge stash and you've been doing this for a while is a lot of times those yarns are really not available. So you have to make compromises. What I wanted was a yarn that was of this size or grist, but I wanted something that was black because I really loved the clarity of the twill lines in the areas that had the black coloring. So I ordered Jaeger Spun's merino in black. It wasn't their Zephyr, it was just straight merino. I think it's in 8-2. And I wove the fabric. And I thought, well, I will wash it the same way I wash this sample. Well, I've already talked enough about how merino fulls super easy. So when I pulled the fabric, the actual fabric, out of the dryer, I nearly had a heart attack. These are exactly the same fabric. Now, I will say the coloring in here, this pink into yellow, is because this was a hand-painted warp. That coloring hadn't showed up yet when I was weaving the sample, but it's a completely different cloth. And you know, when you open a dryer and you have this surprise of something you weren't expecting, there is the immediate response of, oops, I screwed this up. I think it's really important to not do that to yourself, because we don't really ever, you don't make mistakes in this. It's just something that makes you go down a different path than you originally planned. And actually, I've found more often than not, that's a really good thing. So I took that fabric to my guild meeting that night, and everyone just, thought that this was one of the most beautiful fabrics I'd ever woven. And I really debated whether to mention my huge faux pas in not planning that merino felts really easily. So the coat that's on the form over behind me is the end result of that. And I will tell you that this coat has gotten many, many years of wear. It is my absolutely favorite thing in my wardrobe. It has a thermal interlining in it, and it is super warm for northern New Jersey weather. Very often, I will go up into my vast stash of leftovers and unused pieces and yardage that, for my production years, and I'll pull something out and I will give it a try. Just see what would have happened had I really pushed this fabric. Back in my craft fair days in the 80s, I did a number of Afghans, which we now call throws, but at the time that was the title, and I did them in a bunch of colorways. The warp was a gradient of Harrisville singles, which is why I had all that left over, and the weft was alpaca. So it had a beautiful hand to it, and I used an 8-shaft pattern, and they were very pretty. So this was a hand-washed, air-dried sample. This is the fabric that I found in the attic, had already been hand-washed. I don't have anything right from the loom, but you can see, it's soft, it's okay, it's a little spongy. But I thought, what would happen if I actually put it through its paces? So let me say that there are different degrees of machine washing. This first sample, I put it in the machine and I washed it and dried it, but on very gentle cycle in cold water. So I did get some fulling, but I still see the pattern, and I'm starting to get this beautiful alpaca haze, which is which is very desirable to me. But what happens when I throw that in the washing machine and dryer on a full cycle? Now, you may say, oh my goodness, you've ruined it, because you've really lost any clarity of design. However, if I lived in the northern wilds of Canada and I needed something super, super warm, boiled wool is a thing. And this fabric, even though I've lost the clarity of the original design, is amazingly dense and yet pliable and soft. And this would be one of the warmest vests you could ever use. So how you wash it and what your end product will be, again, the washer and dryer is all part of the design team. It should be noted that if the sample exposed to maximum wet finishing comes out saggy and sleazy and yeah, it could be an indication that the set wasn't correct. The goal with hand-woven fabric is to have a cloth that will support construction details. And though it doesn't happen often, mostly because I'm experienced, I'm not opposed to reslaying a fabric. That means setting the warp threads denser or closer together to get a better result. Now, I do want to mention that I never ever use fabric softeners or dryer sheets. They coat the fibers and the guts of my machines, and I don't like my fibers coated with anything. White vinegar in the rinse cycle balances out the alkalinity of detergents, softens the water and the clothes, and of course my cloth, and it helps excess detergent rinse away. Keeps the colors fresh and bright. It also reduces odors, helps pet hair and lint wash away, and cleans your machine. I don't think I've ever washed a load of clothes in my adult life that didn't use a half a cup of distilled white vinegar in the rinse dispenser of my machine. It's something that my mom taught me. She still does it at 89 years old. Now, if you do an internet search, it will give mixed information about vinegar corroding seals and hoses of washing machine plumbing. Some sites say it can be a problem, and some sites say that's ridiculous. Let me just say that I've never in more than 45 years of owning a washing machine ever had a hose or seal fail. The important thing here is to know your machine and read the manual, talk to the manufacturer, do some research on that machine on the internet. And I welcome your comments below if you find that your experience is different. None of us can ever know every possibility in every circumstance. What's most important is that you be curious. It's helpful to take scraps of old projects and to see what would have happened if you had tossed them in the washer and dryer. This particular fabric was one of my least favorite that I ever wove. I don't know what I was thinking. The warps are all mixed cottons and rayons, and I had a double weft of mohair, and I never liked it. I thought it was ugly, and I don't usually do ugly fabrics. I had a huge hunk of it left in the attic, which I came across one day, and so I thought, well, let's see what happens if. Now, I just wanted to point out that the brushed part of this was done, when I use mohairs like this, what I do is I put the yardage under tension before I advance to the next area of cloth to be woven, and I will use a sweater brush to actually brush up the pile. So this works so well if this cloth is under tight tension, both warp and weft. I'll work from the center out and then flip and use my other hand to work from the center to the other side. And that brings up the pile beautifully, but keeps the warps and wefts from distorting. So I took that sample of fabric that that was actually a nice couple yards of fabric, that I didn't like, and I threw the whole thing in the washer and dryer. And what I ended up with when I opened the dryer made me so happy. I loved the feel. I love the tweedy look of it, and I made this vest, and I still to this day wear this vest. It is one of my favorite pieces of handwoven clothing that I have, that I wear all winter long in my studio because I like to keep the heat down. And so even old fabric, that maybe old pieces that you've already made but are beyond their prime and need to be freshened up, try washing and see what happens. I'm Daryl Lancaster for the Weaver Sews.